Hello, everybody. Welcome back to A Few Minutes of History. I'm your host, Jake, and today I'm very honoured to be joined by Peter Mathews. Peter, firstly, thank you for joining me, and secondly, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you, and I'm happy and honoured to be able to talk to you.
Peter, the honour's mine. I mean, I've read some of your story online and a few of the interviews that you've done in the past, and you've got quite the story, I must say, and that was one of the reasons I was so excited to actually get you onto the show, because you have a very unique story. I mean,
Yes, it seems that way. Everyone's reaction is similar to yours, and of course, yes, it is indeed a story that is unusual because I was not American when I was in the army. So it's there's so many stories within the story.
Absolutely. Now, Peter, we'll start maybe from the beginning. Where are you originally from, and how did you find yourself in the States?
Okay, I'm originally from The Hague, Den Haag, in the Netherlands. I was born on June 2nd, 1945, and as I grew up, my dad, who is a jazz musician, he left me when I was 3 years old, so I did not have any memory of him. I attended a school, public school, and I did not do well. I had dyslexia, so they assigned me to the Montessori school system, in which I remained and did much better for the remainder of my school years. My first memory of anything with the war is I took a walk with my mom when I was about 6 or 7, and there was a large section in The Hague that had been bombed accidentally by the Allies in the last days of the war. And that was called friendly fire, which came back a couple of times during my lifetime. My dad went to the United States. His name is Mathews, and he became quite famous. He worked for the Newport Jazz Festival, Carnegie Hall, and he came to do a world tour, and he came to Amsterdam. And I was about 9 years old, I think, 10 maybe. And I saw him on TV. I had heard him on the radio quite a few times. I saw him on TV that night. And the next day, I was to meet him at my grandmother's home, where he stayed, his mother, that is. So I took my bicycle, I went there. And it was very strange in a sense that he was a public figure. He had articles in the newspaper. He was, and it was sort of strange to look at a person. I was told who was my father, but I had no connection other than what I saw that day. He cried quite a bit. I didn't know what to think of it. I was confused, obviously. And I would not see him after that for quite a few years, except again on TV or radio in Holland. My mom had remarried, and so I had a stepdad. She remarried. I was about 6 years old, and he worked. He had a government job, and that kind of it's maybe not fair to say, but that kind of personality. He was very strict. He was very organized. He was everything that my own dad was not, which I think is the reason that my mom probably married him. She wanted. After being married to a musician who was always full around, going all over the place, she wanted steady and an income she could count on. But my stepdad and I had totally different personalities. He was not abusive, but I just could not get along. And later on in life, I realized it must have been difficult for him too, because to be married to a woman whose ex-husband is on TV and newspapers and everything. It was all around them all the times. But I think I was, after Montessori school, I did not finish high school. And I went to an art school because I was pretty good. I had some artistic abilities, drawing, painting. And I was pretty happy there. But I must have been 17, 18. And I knew it sort of was inevitable. My stepdad and I had sort of a shoving match. Not much more than that. But I knew I had to leave, and I decided to go to the United States. I know it would hurt my mom, but sort of my mom knew also that the writing was on the wall. If I had stayed in Holland, I probably would have stayed away from him too. So I didn't have a lot of money, so I took a job on a boat, a Norwegian ship called the Black Diamond. And I planned to go to New York on the boat, working on the boat, and then jump ship once I arrived. And that's exactly what I did. So I arrived, I was 18 years old. I had about $200 to my name. And it was a bit of a culture shock, arriving in a big city like that. I had no idea where my dad would be. He didn't have a steady place. I was hoping to meet up with him sometime, but I had no clue as to where to find him. So at first, I stayed around the center of Manhattan, Times Square area. And in those days, they had movies one after the other, and the film would go 24 hours, 7 days a week. It just repeats itself. And it cost you 35 cents to get in. And a lot, besides myself, a lot of people who didn't have a place to sleep, they slept there at night. So I remember the movie because I saw it about 100 times. It was called Zulu. Mm. It was just a slaughterhouse, so to speak. And that's how I slept. So meantime, I walked around and I found a restaurant. I was looking for a job that would have me come in late at night, sort of right around closing time, and I would clean up the place, the whole kitchen and everything. I stayed there by myself. It's worked out very well because I could grab some food. The sinks were big enough for me to wash in, myself that is. And then later on, I would go back to the movies and sleep the rest of the day. I became friends with the owner. The owner lived in New Jersey, and he sort of took a liking to me. And he invited me one weekend to his home, which was an average home, but to me, it looked like he must have been a millionaire. It was that kind of situation. And I got to the point where he said he would be my sponsor. In those days, you had to get a sponsor to become a legal immigrant. He would be responsible for me if I got sick or if I committed a crime. And him and his wife decided to sponsor me. And that was probably in mid-65, 1965. So I got my green card, they call that, my immigration papers. And behold, within 4 months, right after that, I got a letter saying I was being drafted. I was really in shock. So I went to the draft board. They said, how can I be drafted? I'm not a citizen. But they told me, you have two choices. You can go home and never return, or you can join the army. Well, I guess at my age, being young and maybe stupid, I decided I wanted to stay in the United States. And I entered the army in January 2nd of 1966. I was flown to Fort Carson, which is in Colorado Springs. Mm-hmm. I remained there till December of 66. And there was a big unit there. They were training for Vietnam, but I was not part of it. So rumors had it that a couple of us would probably be assigned to Germany, which would have been fantastic if that happened. I would have been a couple of 100 miles from home. But at the last moment, they told me, no, you're going to Vietnam as well, training or no training. So I left for Vietnam. I arrived there in late December of 66. And that's where I started my year-long, it was supposed to be a year, and then you go home again. So without the proper training, though, I was assigned immediately to a company called the 1st Cavalry, which was a big unit called Airmobile, because they had a lot of helicopters to her. And it was the kind of a unit that where other units would be somewhat in trouble and needed help. They would fly us in on the spot and I can't say rescue them, but support them and help them. That was the mission of the company. So I saw a lot of action. I made a lot of landings on the fire. There is one situation where I was on an LZ. An LZ is called a landing zone. And they were all over Vietnam. They were strategically placed so that they could land helicopters on it, and they usually had an artillery unit on top of it as well. And the purpose was that the artillery and the way they were spaced throughout the country, wherever you were in the country, you were always covered by artillery, no matter where you were. It's pretty much like radar for the weather. And I was there. We were there for 2-3 days. We were supposed to relax a bit before going out again. And they attacked us and they hit the ammunition area. And it became like, it was amazing. It was like hell on earth because they all started exploding. Also, it had large amounts of fuel for helicopters that also exploded. And it was just a mess. And we all scrambled to go into a bunker. And we were watching this thing. The guy next to me, who I had never met because we all went to the nearest bunker, we were looking. And of course, on the backside where it's an open area because that's how you get into the bunker. And then there's a small area in the front to face the enemy. But what happened is the shrapnel from one of those exploding devices hit this guy's arm, and it nearly took off his arm. His name was Carl. So we had no supplies. We couldn't get out because it would have been suicide. So I band-aid him up as well as I can with my T-shirt, and I had to take my shoelaces to put a tourniquet to keep him from bleeding. And he was at first in shock, of course. Then we got attacked. So I had, by myself, he was of no use. I had to fend off my position, which I did. And I think the Vietnamese withdrew also because they were directly being hit with the fire of our explosions from our own dump. So luckily they left and I was able to hold them. It took 4 to 6 hours for the whole thing to end. And of course, this guy, Carl, was in a lot of pain. At first he was in shock, but then he was in pain. He made no sense talking to him. But I kept him conscious. And afterwards, when it died down, we came out of, there was basically nothing left. It had a hospital, it was gone. There were burning helicopters. And I put him in a helicopter and I never saw him again. But he must have talked to the authorities or something, or to his superiors, because I received what was called a bronze medal for that. It's okay. That was just one of them. My big turnaround in Vietnam happened in November of '67. It was a small town with a base. The base had an airstrip. They actually could land C-130s cargo planes on it. But all the fighting was around it. The battle, it was called the Battle of Dak To. There was a unit from the 4th Army who was on top of a hill called 724 and had been fighting there for nearly 10 days. We flew into it to help them and relieve them. It was total devastation. As we got closer, you could see there was a burned out helicopter on top of the hill. There was not a tree left standing all around, just from the constant fighting and bombardments. And we got assigned into that. So we took over. By that time, I had become a sergeant and a squad leader and also a machine gunner. So we took our position and we were there for 3 days and they attacked us again. And what they would do, they would quietly get as close as they can because if they were close, they were not subject to our artillery. If they stayed away far, we would call in the artillery, and as they came up the hill, they would be demolished, annihilated before they even got close. So they were always very sneaky to get as close as possible and then attack. We called in artillery anyway, but it just wave after wave. They would just keep coming. I mean, the bodies were there, and it didn't face them, or at least they were so up on it. And it took 3-4 hours that night to repel them, where they withdrew again. And we stayed another 2 days. There were always incoming rounds during the day. They would, from the adjacent hills, they would mortar us, just to keep us on our toes and then harass us. But they didn't attack again. So my lieutenant, my platoon leader, called me over and said, I want you to take 3 guys and go down the hill. They were very big in those days on body counts. Matter of fact, I had one lieutenant says, you count anything, dogs, cats, anything that's dead becomes a dead enemy. I know. It's just the way it was. I guess it made them look good. So I went down this hill and it was just pretty bad. We had to be very careful because we've had encountered before when we did that some of the wounded soldiers would prop themselves and sit there with their rifle before they died and hope to get a last shot at us as we came down the hill. So it was very tricky, and we had to be very careful. But none of them were alive. It was all dead soldiers. I would say on my side, we had 3 groups going to each side of the hill. On my side, I probably counted about 40, 50 Vietnamese soldiers who had died there. As we got lower and lower off the hill, we came to an area that looked like a staging area. They took off their backpacks, they left them together in a bundle. And we figured, let's take a look at those. But again, we had to be careful because they would booby trap these things. Where either if you lifted one up or you opened it up. So we stayed from the distance, and we threw rocks at it. We fired some shots into them, and nothing happened. So we went. I said, let's go and take a look. I said there were about 5 or 6 backpacks. It so happened when the one I opened had a small diary in it, what looked like a small booklet. It was wrapped in plastic to protect it from the constant rain in Vietnam. And when I opened it, it was just one page after the other of art in full color. The handwriting was amazing. There was some music in it, a written page. I would say the booklet was 200 pages. Half of it had been filled in by this book. And it was just it was art all the way across. So normally, if you find something, you have to turn it in because it could have military value. But I immediately decided to keep it because I did not see how this could possibly have anything in it that was of military significance. And I did. I put it in my pocket, and I kept it in my pocket. I never showed it to anyone. Also, at that time, it was November, mid-November. I was to go home mid-December because I had been there for a year in the middle of December. So I was very nervous, having been thrown into a big fight like that. They picked us up from the hill, and I remember as we went up higher and higher, first you could see the devastation of the hill. And then as you get higher, it's an ocean of hills and mountains of beautiful green. The landscape was just beautiful to look at. And this brown spot of the hill we had fought over just became smaller and smaller. And I just couldn't help but think, what on earth are we doing? The Vietnamese were attacking us. We were repelling them. And now it's all over. They left. We left. Maybe in 10 years, all the trees are growing back up, and nobody will ever know the difference, who was there, who died there, and what was the purpose. It just became a question, and it was hard to explain in my head what on earth we were doing there to begin with. Well, we went to the base, actually, which was also constantly under air attack and bombs from the Vietnamese, because it had this landing zone. We saw 2 C-130s get blown up, but we remained in the hills around it to try to find these guys who were bombarding the base 24/7. We encountered a couple of groups, but they were sort of avoiding us. The North Vietnamese were very good at pick and choose when they wanted to meet us, unless we ran into them by accident. But I'm sure they kept an eye. They were much better in the terrain, and they knew. I always had a feeling they knew exactly where we were, and they only would attack if it was somewhat to their advantage. So we had some skirmishes. We lost a couple of more, and on the 8th of December was my last day, and I was going to jump in a helicopter and leave. I got there with 17 guys from Colorado, and only 4 of us came back out of the 17. So 13 close people that I knew had passed away, had died. As I flew out of there, it was weird. I had to say goodbye to the guys I was with for so long. It was a feeling of am I leaving them? But I also realized I had done my share. And it was hard to fly away and look at them, knowing that nothing would change for them. But for me, it was my last flight out. And so I went to a place near Da Nang, which had a big airstrip where the flights came in from the United States and left. And I spent 2 or 3 days there doing paperwork to get out. And while I was doing that, my foot locker was broken into. And they took a lot of stuff out of my foot locker. I had a Vietnamese belt from North Vietnamese soldiers, some papers from North Vietnamese, and it was gone. But somehow the booklet was still in there. They didn't see it or they didn't care for it. So at that point, I kept it in my pocket no matter where I went. So from there, I went to, they flew me to Seattle, Washington, where we landed. And again, they put us in a bus and they took us to a base near Seattle. And then when you go in the bus, your life goes on. It's like a normal city. Like nobody knows there's a war going on or anything. It was just surreal to have come from a war zone and then land and everything is perfectly normal. Like it doesn't exist. But anyway, I was dismissed. I was giving an honorable discharge 2 months early. I had really 2 months left in my 2 year of service, but it wouldn't pay for them to assign me for 2 months to a base in the United States. So they said, we're going to give you an early out and a ticket to Newark, New Jersey, and then you're done. At the airport, I had to be what's called on standby, military standby, and that means you get a seat if there's one available. Mm. So it took me about 4 hours, but I got a seat on a Pan Am flight. Also, the sad thing is during the stay at the airport, the sentiment in the United States against the war was pretty high. Mm. So I got a few times cursed at and told I was a baby killer, stuff like that. But I decided to just bite my tongue because it was something I could not, I couldn't win. I was in uniform. I was a target. So I went back. We flew back to Newark, and I landed. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning, and of course, all the other soldiers, they had family waiting, which I did not, of course. But I took a taxi, and I went to the house where the guy that I worked for, who owned the restaurant, like I said, he lived in New Jersey, and that's where I went. They were very kind. They let me stay for a couple of weeks. I had some money left because I didn't take my pay every day in Vietnam. I had no way to spend it, except a few occasions in bars, and let's call them social workers, girls. So I had some money left. I found an apartment, and I started doing odd jobs such as painting, light carpentry work, and I started to do okay. So in February, I decided I'm going to get my citizenship, the United States citizenship. So I went to the immigration office. They gave me the papers. They said, yes, here are the papers, fill them out, come back. They gave me a date. I think it was March 26th. And we'll take your papers, and then we'll give you a date to be sworn in as a citizen. So I filled everything out. I took my driver's license, my green card. I went back, and I was denied my citizenship. I totally freaked out. I cursed. I said, what the hell do you mean I'm denied? And the man explained to me that for a person to become a citizen, you have to be an immigrant for 5 years. I said, well, doesn't Vietnam mean anything?
Yeah, that's bizarre, isn't it? You were drafted into the army. You'd have thought that
yeah, everybody was just going to be automatic. You're going to be a citizen,
Yeah.
I freaked out. I had a hangover from Vietnam anyway, and it sort of knocked me for a loop. I went home. I drank. I was always a pretty good drinker, but I drank a lot that day. And I decided to throw everything in the garbage can, meaning my uniform, anything to do with the army, except the diary. And I threw it away. I decided then, this is it. I'm going back to Holland. Mm. So I called my mom, who I had not talked to for all the time I was in the army, who was very worried. They didn't know for a whole year what happened to me, where I was in Vietnam, whether I was alive or not. And I said, I'm coming home, and this time it's for good. I'm not staying. So there was only one problem with that. I lost my passport. I couldn't find it, my Dutch passport. So I had no way of leaving the United States. And I called that I was a man without a country. So I went to the Dutch embassy, and they said it would take about 6 to 8 weeks to find your birth certificate, have everything transferred. So I was sort of stuck. I couldn't go anyplace. And I started drinking a lot. I got what's called a DUI. It's just driving while intoxicated. I got arrested for that. And I had to appear in court for that about 30 days later. But I got another one 2 weeks later. And that was my second one within 2 weeks. So when I went in front of the judge, they knew I had two of them. And he put me in jail for 30 days. And he said, I better never see you here again because you're going for 6 months or a year. So I spent 30 days in jail. And after that, I did not have, I lost my place where I lived because I didn't pay the rent. And I started living in my station wagon. I didn't, at the time, I didn't want to go back to, this guy's name was Alex, who was the owner of the restaurant. I didn't want to go back. I was in bad shape. I didn't want to embarrass him and make him think he sponsored the wrong guy. But after living in the car and not doing anything and being almost without money and food, I went to his house. I had no choice. I had no place to go. And they opened me with, they were great. They invited me. We talked a lot. And he said, you can stay as long as you want. And I did. It turned me around a bit. And again, I worked and I got back to working and making some money. And eventually I got my apartment again so I could move out of their home. And that was, by that time, it was probably mid-68. So I started doing well again. I didn't stop drinking, but at least I didn't drive to the bar and drive home. It was a strange feeling because if I brought up in a bar, that is, how I was rejected from being a citizen and how, I disagreed with the decision. More times than once, the answer of the guys that I was talking to was, well, if you don't like it here, go home. That happened a lot. It's like a national standby answer. So a little while later, a friend of mine who was a musician, I met some musicians because occasionally my dad would be in New York and I met him for 1 or 2 days before he moved on again. But I met a lot of musicians and I met a guitar player and him and I got to be friends. And we decided to open a boutique. A boutique is a place where you sell he and she clothing and jewelry. And, it was like a hippie type thing in those days, talking 69 or something. And because I had worked in one of them to build a counter space and cubby holes for jeans and stuff. And so these guys do all right. So him and I, his name was Vinny, we decided to open a boutique, and we called it the Windmill for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So, and one night before closing, a woman works there, a very attractive woman. And she said, how come you're naming it the Windmill? I said, well, obviously I'm from the Netherlands. And she was too. That's why she stopped in. And we got together. We started dating. And eventually we moved in together. And we decided to get married, which we did. It was sort of on the spot. Meantime, I found out my dad had now permanently moved to Rochester. He had his fourth wife. He was on his fourth marriage. And I said, you know what, my wife and I said, my wife's named Joanne. I said, let's go to Rochester and see what's going on there. We moved to Rochester. So I found out, of course, I had a stepmother and I had 3 sisters and a brother. And we stayed there for probably 2-3 years. And while we were there, my daughter was born. We named her Tamer. And I swore to myself I would never leave her and protect her for the rest of her life. So what happened is my dad, I guess he got itchy or something. And one day he just left the kids, left his wife. my stepmother, she took the youngest child and she went to Toronto, but she left the other three. And the other three were thrown into the foster care of the state of New York. And they wound up in Long Island, which is back near New York City.
Mm.
So my wife and I, we picked up and we went back to New Jersey, and we got them out of the foster system and took them in for a while. But they too, they were in their mid-teens at that time. They decided to all go to Toronto as well and be with their mother, which we helped them to do. So while I was back in New Jersey, I was working in a home. I was doing the outside residing and roofing, and I started to have an affair with the woman who lived in the house. It immediately, I knew that this would lead to the end of my marriage as it was. And I was right. It took 6, 7, 8 months. Sometimes an affair sounds juicy or something, but it's also very difficult. It's the lying, the hiding, the thing. And I knew it was the end of my marriage, and indeed it did. My wife found out, and she took my baby girl and she went back to Holland with her. And I immediately thought she was 3 years old. And I said to myself, oh, wow, here I was going to protect her and stay with her for the rest of my life. And I wound up doing exactly the same my dad did. Left me, 3 years old. My baby girl went back to Holland. I would not see her again until she was an adult. So, but the girl I was having the affair with, she too got divorced. She had 2 boys, and we got married. She was a very stable person for me. It turned my life around a bit. Of course, meantime, I always had this diary with me, which was remarkable that with all the moving around, the homelessness, the being in jail and everything, I somehow still had that diary. So, I always thought of it had to be like a destiny type.
I was going to say, it sounds very like destiny.
Yeah.
You keep hold of it, doesn't it?
It sure was. So, but I was busy making a living. I had 2 boys from her first marriage, and we got 1 more boy between ourselves. And you know how it goes. Time flies. You're working. You got kids to grow up. So it wasn't until I would say 2022 that a big change happened. I was working in a home nearby, and when there was time, my son worked with me at that time. And by the time it was time to pay, he invited me. He had an office down in his basement. And as I walked in, the first thing I noticed on his desk, he had one of those pointy little Vietnamese hats that farmers wear a lot. They're made out of either bamboo or straw.
Yeah.
Wow, I said, what are you doing with that? So he told me he had adopted 2 children from Vietnam. I said, wow. And immediately I thought of the diary again, very vividly. So I said, do you know people who speak and write Vietnamese? And he said, yes, I do. I said, I would love to come back tomorrow, show you this booklet, and maybe have some pages translated for me, because I had no idea still what was in it. So I did, and I just at random, I picked 5 pages. We took pictures of it, and he sent it to some friends he had in the Boston area, and they sent us back the translations. 1 page he was dedicated to his parents. He said he missed them 1,000 times, and he also said, "Don't wait for me." All the pages when he spoke about something, on the end, the realization was in it that he may never be back, or he wrote a poem for his girlfriend, how he missed her, how he wanted to marry her, but again, he said, I'll probably never see her again. It was always like that. But there was 1 page, and that was the amazing thing, is it didn't look like any other page. It was sort of scribbling, because all the other pages were either full drawings or full writing. And to my amazement, it was his name, his parents' name, his address with the P.O. box and everything, all on that 1 page.
Wow.
So I was shocked. I was happy. I was I couldn't believe it, that after all these years, it was always in that booklet. So my son and I, we started putting everything out on the internet, hoping that someone would catch something. I mostly got calls from professors from Harvard University, Columbia University, who had departments for Asian studies and Vietnamese, stuff like that. But it wasn't until January 23 that a local reporter here from the newspaper got to see those pages. And she called me and she wanted to do an interview to write an article in the paper. And she came over, it took about an hour and a half. And this was, actually that was late December of 22. She said, we'll probably don't get it published till January sometime. I said, fine. I said, anything you can do. So she called me and it was to be published January 29th on the Sunday paper. And she did, it was on the front page, and she did a page and a half on the whole story of me looking for it. The writer, I was amazed how the attention. So it turned out that it's called the Bergen Record, was part of what is called a larger outfit called the USA Today, which is that publishes all over the United States. And indeed, it went to several cities throughout the United States. So my son and I, we were elated because we figured maybe somebody now will. So what actually happened is they had an office in Hanoi, the USA Today, and that's when they found out. And as soon as the Vietnamese saw the article with the name, I got a phone call from them almost overnight. It was amazing how fast it happened. From the head of the Vietnamese Veterans Association. And he said he wanted to get more information for me. I said, I was delighted. At least now somebody in Vietnam knew. So the next thing that happened, they sent a TV crew. They had a TV crew in Washington, D.C. They sent them to my house. My wife and I, we talked to them for about an hour. We showed them several pages of the booklet. And it was televised in Vietnam. After that, a week later, I got a call from a lawyer, a Vietnamese lawyer. And she wanted to come over to the house. I couldn't understand why, but later on I did. She wanted to come over to the house, look at the booklet, and make sure it was authentic.
Okay.
So, yeah. And she took pictures of every page in the book, and she sent it back to Vietnam. Because I don't have skills on the internet. I was sending the guy 2 or 3 pages, and I think he got tired of that. he sent this lawyer who could send the whole thing in one shot. So, and after that, things kept rolling. It went very fast. They kept me up to date. I got calls from newspapers in Vietnam, a couple of TV stations. I had to do an interview. The time difference from here, where I am, and North Vietnam is exactly 12 hours. For them, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I had to do an interview at 3 o'clock in the morning, which I was happy to do. But the reception was not great, so I tried to go outside and see if my phone worked better, and I found a spot. The problem was I was in my T-shirt, and it was February, and it was freezing. So I had to do this interview sort of shivering. I was happy to do it. I did quite a few of those. There were several TV stations, So then they started looking for the name. They said they found 5 soldiers with pretty much the same name, but none of them in the area where he lived. By the way, I was amazed how accurate records they kept. I was always thinking of them as being chaotic during the wartime. They had records of everybody. So apparently they couldn't find the exact same with the address. Also, what happened is the area where he used to live had been bombarded heavily during that part of North Vietnam was bombarded very heavily by the United States. Matter of fact, the province where he lived had received 15,000 bombs over the years by
Wow.
B-52s. I saw some of them. It was like huge craters and stuff. But anyway, so they figured maybe the families moved. Then what happened is they found a soldier who had served with him. And he took a look at the booklet. And what he did was his middle name, which was Van, V-A-N, he changed it to X-A-U-N. And I think this was because he wanted to be a writer or something. But it threw everybody off until they figured that out. And at that time, it took them 24 hours, and they found he had 2 sisters who were still alive and a cousin. So they told me again, we're going there tomorrow at 3:00. And I could watch on my cell phone as for the first time they would go to the family. They were very careful because they didn't want to contact the wrong family, of course, have their hopes up and then disappoint them. So my wife and I was again 3:00 in the morning. We watched as probably 5, 6 TV stations were following them. They were high-ranking officials. By the way, the person who had served with him was the ambassador to Russia right now.
Wow.
He came back especially to be part of the event. We watched it on my cell phone, and it was, it was crying time, happy crying. It was very emotional to see those sisters and the cousin. They were crying. And it turned out that's all they had. No photo of the soldier exists. And they have nothing about him other than this diary now. And in the Vietnamese culture, if you don't have the body, which they never found, it's like his soul is not home. So they regarded this diary as his soul that came home. And they had something that they never had. They did not know that. They knew he died. They felt he died, but especially they did not get word that he became a martyr 9 years after the war. So, and they have a shrine for him in the house. So it was a relief, and it was with sadness and happiness, every emotion you can think of, to see that at that time. Next thing, they called me and they said, Vietnamese Airlines is going to pay for you and your wife for the trip. And the Vietnamese government is going to pay for the hotels and everything else. So we did, obviously. We left on March the 2nd. First we flew to San Francisco and then from there to Vietnam. We landed in Hanoi. In Ho Chi Minh City, which is Saigon. I thought they were waiting for a movie star or something. When we walked out of the plane, it was crazy. It was the reporters, the TV cameras. My wife and I were totally taken back. We had no expectation because I had no idea what to expect. Would there be hatred still toward us?
I was going to say, what were you apprehensive going over there at all?
Absolutely. My son was very worried. I said, "Don't worry, they invited us. They're not going to arrest me." But we had mixed feelings. We had uncertainty, of course, but it was gone immediately. The officials met us at the plane. We didn't even go through customs or anything. They gave us flowers. Like I said, there was reporters. We stayed in Saigon for probably 2 hours, and then we had to go and fly into what used to be North Vietnam, to a place near where the soldier had lived. This was about an 1.5-hour flight. When we got there were even more reporters. It was just so they took. We immediately, as we arrived at the airport, we were assigned a translator that stayed with us for the whole 10 days. We were there for 10 days. Very nice girl. She spoke well English. And they drove us. And as we're going through the countryside, I got some flashbacks. I saw those green rolling hills with the rice paddies in between. it brought back some stuff. And my wife and I, especially my wife, she's like, where in the hell are we going to stay? Because it became a real rural area. Are we going to stay in what kind of hotel? But somehow there was a smaller town, but it had a huge hotel. It was a beautiful 5-star hotel they put us up. And that ended our first day. I did some interviews that night with different papers in the hotel. And the next morning, we would drive out to meet the family. And again, as we arrived there, you could hardly get through the crowd, the people from the town, the reporters, the TV. And I went into this very modest home, and I met the first sister, the oldest sister, who was in a wheelchair. Then the other sister showed up, and the cousin showed up, and I was able to sit with them and exchange some words and things. And my wife and I had brought some roses to put on the altar of the fallen soldier. And we spent probably about an hour or so. And then they drove us to the center of the town, which had like a large meeting hall. And that place was packed with spectators. And I had to go on stage. I had never done a speech in front of anyone. And I had not rehearsed anything or written down anything, because I didn't want to read off a piece of paper. I wanted it to be as I felt that day.
Yeah.
And my wife was very proud. She said, I talked for about 10 minutes. And the theme of my speech was that, and this is true in the United States, all through, by the way, it was 56 years and 81 days later that I found the booklet. All through this time, I had confrontations with either soldiers, or at one time where I went to a Vietnamese organization of refugees here in the United States that had to flee after the war ended. And when I showed them the booklet, they all said it was a book of the enemy, and they didn't even want to look at it. Mm-hmm. Until I forced them to look at it. And when they saw the beauty of the writings and the handwriting and the pictures that he drew, it changed their minds. It opened them to the point where they looked at it as a human being instead of an enemy soldier who wrote it.
Yeah, humanized the person, I guess, doesn't it?
And that was the gist of my story that I told in the public. Of course, the interpreter was standing next to me, translating everything. And at that point, I got to actually hand over the booklet to his oldest sister. And it was very nice. There were a lot of dignitaries, officials, you name it, they were there. And they handed my wife believe it or not, a statue of Ho Chi Minh. I don't think there are too many homes in the United States with a statue of Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah, no, that's quite a unique.
I have one in my house. So. And after that, they asked me where we wanted to go. We spent another day in the area. They took us to a park. It was a large park. It was a shrine, sort of. It had craters from bombs. It had, it was a open park, war memorial, so to speak. And I felt a bit uncomfortable in it. When you see the devastation, it had one bomb that killed 10 women. The name was Park. The park was named after that, Park of the 10 Dead, or the Martyrs, they call them. So it was a sad looking, a lot of school children came in buses and so. And as I was there, the only time then was when a reporter tried to ask me how I felt about the war. Well, I never felt good about the war.
Yeah.
But I told them, I said, look, I'm here on a humanitarian mission, and I am not going to open up a can of worms about what my position is on the war.
Yeah.
And they respected that. It was the one and only and last time that the reporters would ask me about that. So I was happy about that. And like I said, overall, we were treated like king and a queen. Matter of fact, the funny part is, not funny, but it just so happened. How in a hotel they play sort of background music. And after one time, we walked back into the hotel, and believe it or not, the song was playing from David Bowie, "Heroes." We can be heroes just for one time, just for one day. And it just struck us as another one of those accidental things that all fell into place. We spent about 5-6 days back in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. We had a great time. People would meet us on the street, want to take pictures with us, stuff like that. And then we flew back, and it was fantastic. Upon coming back, I was interviewed by Channel 2 News here in New York City. They did an interview with us. This was very nice too. They came to the house, spent almost 5-6 hours at my home. I was started to get recognition from veteran groups and things. They did articles. So everything's turned pretty well. For the first time, I could join veterans groups. I had tried to join veteran organizations, but especially right after Vietnam, I tried it and I couldn't do it. These guys, I know they're all patriots and they were all ex-soldiers, but they would still, pledge the Legion. They would do names of fallen soldiers missing in action, stuff like that. I just couldn't, especially in the early days after the war, since I had been denied citizenship.
Yeah.
I could never get into that. But after my return from Vietnam, the atmosphere was somewhat different, and I was able to really become more involved. And they made, I was in a parade, stuff like that. But it was something that it was closure for them, but it was also very much closure for myself.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Do you feel like you got some closure and lifted a big weight off your own shoulders?
Very much. And what happened too is, especially just before we left, my kids, they read in the papers things that I had never talked about for all those years. And I was now able to speak about it. It's very common for veterans not to talk about the war. They keep it within them. But I'm lucky because of this booklet, I had to come out and talk about it.
Yeah.
And it helped a great deal. I can now discuss this whole thing and discuss Vietnam with my children, with my family, friends. I have no problem. So I'm advocating through programs like yours to tell veterans, start talking, start writing it down, whatever. What really helps me is writing it down. I am writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
And that really had me dig deep to come up with dates and actual things that happened while I was in Vietnam, after Vietnam. And I had to face it, and putting it in writing was really something that made me, I feel better because of it. And I urge any veteran to do the same thing. And
certainly the veterans that I've spoken to, particularly from the Vietnam War, the ones that I've wrote and come onto the show, they echo exactly what you said, Peter, and that's to talk about it, write it down. It does really help. So I think that's a wonderful message that you're saying there.
Absolutely. And right now I'm starting to get speaking engagements. I've gone to high schools. I've gone to Yale University. I'm working with a fellow in Columbia University. So I'm getting the word out, and I'm getting the program out, and it's very satisfying at this point. I missed the booklet. Of course, I have photos of every page of it, and I'm hoping. The problem with writing my book right now is I have so little information on the writer of the book. Not much survives from him. So I'm trying to, and eventually I hope to go back to Vietnam one more time. Because if I complete my book, I would like it to be published in Vietnam itself. The family of him urged me to publish it in Vietnam.
That's wonderful.
And I told them that if so, and if it makes any money, whatever happens in Vietnam is going to be theirs, and they can do with it whatever they want. So that would be my gift to them, and that's where I am today. So I'm looking forward to doing interviews like you, and I'm looking forward to finishing my book. I'm working, again, I'm so bad with computers. I'm working on a website I created called myyearinvietnam.com. It's all one word, My Year in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Take a look at it sometime. I'm working on it. I'm going to improve on it. And that's pretty much my story.
Peter, that's such an incredible story. And thank you so much for sharing it with me and for the audience as well. And what I'll do is I'll link your website in the description of this. So if anyone wants to check it out, they just follow the link and it'll take them to your website. And I'll be sure to put that in as well. Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your story, and what a story it was.
The pleasure is mine. I'm humbled and honored to do it.
Peter, I'm sure we'll stay in touch and we'll continue to communicate. So I bid you farewell for now, and thank you all for listening. Thank you all for listening to Peter's incredible story. And like I say, I'll link his website in the description for you all to check out as well. Peter, one more time, thank you very much for joining me.
I like that. I'll be in touch and keep you posted if anything develops.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.